I will explain why we are in TOSIT and OW2. Because yes, open source is global, but the foundation of open source, like OW2, could be very important in the ecosystem to animate a community, European community, try to have open governance of the project, but with European approach, despite open source stay global. So yes, and I appreciate the talk before, because clearly, why we talk about open source in the French bank, completely transparently, it's because we have a sovereign problem. I think it's the same issue for everyone, but for a bank and French bank, we need to be resilient. We need to be all the questions we have during the last year about the relationship with North American companies, with Trump, and so thank you, Trump, because without him, I am not here today to talk about open source strategy for BPCE, so thank you, Trump. And, but you need to find the right balancing between functionality and innovation. And sometimes when I talk for the data, because I manage at the same time, manage data strategy and open source strategy for BPCE in transversality, it's the balance between the resilience and innovation. Each time it's very complex. We need, because each time we have two choices. The first choice, finally, is the GAFAM, for example, project for data and AI, Google with Gemini, Azure with OpenAI, Google with BigQuery, another. All this stack of data AI, very interesting, very innovative, but with the big dependency, or sometimes you need to take the time and to have an approach of innovation with resilience, and but open standard, open format, accept sometimes to take more time, to have not the same level of innovation, but try to make together, to have a collaborative innovation by the open source. And so it's a fine balancing we need to find in open source, but completely linked with the strategy of autonomy, of resilience, of interdependency management we want for BPCE. And so to do that, we have strong foundation, because we are lucky, because we have our own data center. It's very important, because when you want to host your service, when you do, and you want to do open source, the capacity to integrate this open source, package or not, or package this open source by yourself, but the capacity to deploy that and to host your software, your business process and your data is very important. The skill and expertise, because and sometimes people don't know that, but when you are in a bank, the big part of finally people in the bank, it's informatic people. Why? Because we need to develop. You need to have developers, cyber engineer, data engineer, capacity project manager, another. But you have this IT expertise, and we have three possibilities: hosting condition, level of coverage when you need to have an option, and software sourcing choice. And in this software sourcing choice, the open source solution could be a way to find and to answer of some specific needs. The first one, open code, finally, because when you develop your business process with proprietary software, you develop your intellectual property with something you don't have access of the intellectual property of these tools. And so it's very important to understand that, and the management of interdependency, because it's global. Why, for example, I completely avoid the open solution by property solution? But it's because VMware with Broadcom, the capacity to finally buy a company, it's clearly possible, but buy open code, it's sometimes more complex. Open source is more than just a free software. I prefer each time to re-explain open source is an ecosystem first, in not just a free software. It's first one, a code, a soft published with legal licenses. It's developed by collaborative way. I appreciate this approach because it's collaborative, and so it's global, yes, but the capacity to do together, because together we are stronger. It's why, for example, when you need to upfront work and finally reinsurance this strategy for your company, to have, for example, like TOSIT, an association of organizations, public and private, to discuss about open source, to discuss about strategy open source, to do the capacity to do together, to find sometimes solution together, to develop, to co-found together. Finally, my TOSIT, it's my reinsurance capacity for BPCE. And you know, when you are in bank, the cost of the risk is very important. Capacity to be transparent, reversibility. I like this approach because we talk about open source sometimes for software, but I like the open standard. And for example, in my ecosystem of data and AI, the open standard is very important. Iceberg for the open table format, Parquet for open file, MCP for access to facilitate the access of API and other things for AI. So the reversibility is very important on your side. And when you do, and when you want to move forward in open source, you have the possibility to contribute first, contribute by the code, contribute by the specification, contribute by community, contribute by the funding an ecosystem, create an open source. It's very important on this side because one part of the strategy of some TOSIT member is create open source, and like that create a unique and collaborative community together because we are stronger. And you have some usage model is very important, community-based, package OS, and open core. And finally, for me, it's a delicate balance to choose in the strategy. Community, you need to have more knowledge, capacity to integrate, capacity to package. With OS packaged, you have an ecosystem of integrators, so you need to animate that. Open core, it's a delicate balance between the open core, like I explained, and the enterprise component, extension, and other. It's very important, and that's why we decided to go to OW2 and to be a member of OW2. Is because we want to have open source foundation with us, because thanks to the TOSIT, we have the community of people to work and to discuss about open source and sometimes to develop open source, but by the OW2, the capacity to have an open source foundation, or open, very important on your side, for open governance of the project we want to work, project we want to create, project we want to contribute, and project we want, for example, with TOSIT member, develop. And so, for me, it's very important to understand when you have an open source program office in the main organization, is that for my organization, is to animate at the same time my external ecosystem and my internal ecosystem, because open source is a collaborative ecosystem. And so that's why, when you talk about sovereignty, I like to say open source is, for me, the main way you can do that, because we can do together with a collaborative way to innovate, and not just to protect yourself, but innovate together. Open source is not just a protection, it's a capacity to innovate. And it's very important in the strategy of sovereignty, because sometimes you have some people say, okay, with open source it's just protection, we cannot do innovation, so if you want to innovate, we need to keep the GAFA, we need to keep American soft. No, it's possible to innovate with European ecosystem, open source foundation, to community of organization, and we need to structure your approach in your company with open source program office. And so for open source for BPCE, it's already a dynamic we already started. It's not just we're just waiting a go from the management to say go. No, we animate. Thanks to TOSIT, thanks to OW2, thanks to the member of OW2, thanks to the ecosystem, external, internal event, we have already a community of people in BPCE. We try to animate, you have to have a meeting, a monthly meeting to talk about open source, to do breaking news about open source, to give some information about that. We try to each time link TOSIT event and BPCE event, and first data event and open source approach. My objective is not to say open source it's a topic like that in with no concretely position in the company. Open source, we need to add open source in the strategy in any part of the company. Data and AI, infrastructure, virtualization, community, and other. And so my objective is to have a dynamic internal event and external engagement to activate first the open source mindset. After that, you have the capacity to define what will be the open source for BPCE. On your side, clearly, a level for autonomy and sovereignty. The capacity to manage interdependency, capacity to manage by the open source the link and the locking with software editor, capacity by the dual sourcing integrate in the discussion a new challenger, alignment with the priorities of the procurement and service legal department is very important on this part, because when you buy soft, it's very fast, it's very easy, you pay for the consumption, subscription, something like that. When you want to work with open source, you need to pay for the support, you need to pay for the expertise. It's not the same approach for the buyer, it's not the same approach for the legal department, because we need to analyze the conformity of the soft, the licenses we use, the open source model we want to deploy, and other. Security, compliance, and risk. We are a bank, so we are compliant. And for the moment, with the AI integration in the project and all the information about Mythos, all these finally, for me, background, you need to be completely, we need to have the capacity to reassure the IT ecosystem in my company and in the ecosystem about the capacity for open source to manage this security part, to manage this, for example, CV, vulnerability, and the compliance of what we will use in the business process. And already we have the BPCE GitHub since already three years. We will create the GitLab, and so we will immigrate all in GitLab because we decide to leave GitHub, but for the moment we have the BPCE GitHub to show the project we decide to contribute with the fork. And already we create new project by the Natixis Foundation about blockchain, for example, or some stuff like that by the Natixis Foundation. We are a member of TOSIT. It's very important on your side. Already 5 years ago. I am lucky because I am at the same time vice president of the TOSIT now since one year. And TOSIT for me it's an accelerator of the strategy. Because if you want to develop alone your strategy in the ecosystem completely collaborative and open, it's not I think the good way. That's why I completely use the TOSIT like an accelerator. Why? Because thanks to the TOSIT, I have the capacity to have Rex, feedback, open source strategy deployment, capacity to collaborate about any working group. When I have a question, I ask. And so for my open source team and the strategy for open source for BPCE with other people in BPCE, we have this capacity to use TOSIT to like a reassurance, and we have the capacity to discuss. It's for me the proximity community, because when we talk about open source, we talk about community, and sometimes the question of the management is say, okay, your community, look, great, man. But if you have any question, you can activate this community. Yes, because I have my community, but my near community, thanks to TOSIT, with the French ecosystem. The mission of the open source team. So I develop clearly a small team, because we have 100,000 people in BPCE and we are 5 in open source team. So the cost of this team between us is not big. But the main objective is not to be a team to do everything. We are just an enabler for BPCE. My objective is to be an enabler. Enabler to activate an open source mindset, activate open source study, and activate an open source capacity to study all the strategy we want to do with open source. But now, to validate at the end the soft, for example, on the open source soft, we decide to replace or to have a dual approach for other things. For me, the objective of the team is just develop an expertise for the group and to be an enabler to activate in any project. 5 profile: open source project manager, open source market expert, open source governance expert, very important this part, because we want to contribute, we want to create, we want to animate community, we want to activate inner source approach. And so someone with competence of governance is very important. And the technical lead, because when you want to contribute, but you want to we need to have a CI/CD. And it's not easy for a group with own CI/CD to have the capacity to develop open source project with CI/CD completely public, project public, and other. We need to adapt with the guidelines, security guidelines, our strategy of CI/CD to contribute at the project. The team mission is very simple: try to secure the use of open source, promoting a collaborative culture, clearly, because I say it's a collaborative way we do open source. So if I am not collaborative, sorry man, you didn't do your job. R&D on innovation. Why? Because open source is not just protection, it's at the same time innovation. And it's very important to keep this mindset when you have a strategy on open source, because if tomorrow Trump leaves and the new president is completely a friend of European company, we will not develop more the open source strategy, because we will say, the protection is not necessary. So that's why I want to focus about innovation, thanks to the open source, thanks to the community, thanks to the collaboration innovation way. And to do and to try to animate in all this company with all the entities, procurement, legal, the stakeholder of the project, and the representativity of any business IT, is necessary to have an open source authority. Yes, no, you use the name you want. I use open source authority, we can change that, like an open source committee reunion, what do you want? The main objective is to have the capacity to share information, give the possibility for everyone to contribute, capacity to identify the synergy in the group, identify the new studies, the new opportunities, the new risk, and compliance and performance sharing. My objective is we have a community and collective of people wants to work, wants to be interested by open source, and I want to have contributor and very small entity contribute with everyone. Open source team is not just a team who will do open source for BPCE, it's just an enabler and acceleration for BPCE to accelerate an open source. But the objective is any entity of the group need to be the contributor and an actor of that. And that's why we try to create a coordination steering committee or coordination team with animation by my team to coordinate internal vision of open source, study, compliance, innovation together, another. So facilitate by this committee, by this team and this core team, the diffusion of open source way for the sovereignty, for innovation, and I hope at the end to have an open source first strategy, finally at the end, for the acquisition of the new soft and the new technology. Maybe, we will see. But for the moment, focus about facilitate the access of open source for any entity of the group in the strategy plan for the sovereignty first. Thank you.